All right, my name is Karen Gundy-Burlett. I'm the program manager for the NAMS-2 contract, and I'd like to welcome you today to today's edition of Airtime, presented by Crown Innovations in collaboration with UC Berkeley's Citrus and Vanatow Institute. This is a series of seminars on advanced aviation, interesting research, and innovative methodologies in AAM and air traffic management. And today's topic is mapping the world together, collaborative neural implicit mapping under communication constraints. And today's speaker is Dr. Nagar Mehr, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Mechanical Engineering at UC Berkeley. She is a recipient of the NSF Career Award and ONR Young Investigator Program, and was recently recognized as a rising star by ASME and was awarded the IEEE Intelligent Transportation Systems Best PhD Dissertation Award in 2020. Dr. Mehr.
Thank you so much, Karen, for the introduction. I'm very excited to be sharing with you a line of very recent work that we have been doing in our lab. And I would, of course, love to hear thoughts and feedback from the audience and brainstorm later on how these ideas can be used in the context that is most relevant to the scope of this program. So before I dive into the details, I just want to give everyone a little bit background about what our group is interested in. So my group, Intelligent Control Lab at UC Berkeley, works across several emerging applications of autonomous systems, ranging from cars to UAVs to manufacturing and warehouse robotics. And the common theme that we are interested in is no matter what the autonomous system is, we are really looking into how we can get these systems to interact and coexist with one another safely and intelligently. What we are interested in is how can I have multiple agents essentially collectively accomplish something incredible in a safe and efficient manner? How can I have autonomous systems help humans and achieve seamless human-robot interaction? How can I have multiple autonomous systems collaboratively interact with one another and accomplish a task that no single agent can do on its own in a safe and efficient manner? And we work across at a very high level at 4 different directions. We look into perception, how perception looks like in these multi-agent setups. We look at learning in these setups. How can we learn to interact in these scenarios? We look at control and planning challenges. And finally, we look into safety and certifying the safety of the systems. But in the talk today, I'm going to just focus on the perception side. And if I have time left at the end, I'm just going to briefly mention some of the work that we've been doing along the lines of the 3 other directions. But let me start with what I mean by multi-agent perception and how we've been thinking about this problem. So we are actually very much inspired by problems in exploration, whether it is in space or search and rescue, or mapping in the context of fires here in California. That's always something that we think about. And one of the things that my group has been looking into is how can I have multiple agents, autonomous agents, how can I have them deploy a number of them at a large scene and essentially combine information from different agents to build a map of a larger area. So this could be, you could interpret this in the context of mapping or information sharing or coverage control. But I think I'm explaining it in the context of mapping, but the algorithms and methods are really can be used across different applications. So at a high level, what I'm interested in is how can I combine maps from different agents? That's the high level question. But how do we do this? Let me explain first by going over how we essentially plan to just map an environment. And then I'm going to talk about how we have been thinking about combining these maps. So what I mean by mapping an environment is that I'm looking for a way to encode sensory information into a representation that is understandable by the autonomous system and useful for my purposes as, let's say, the human operator that is using them. So there are several ways in the literature that people have used to encode these sensory observations that the system gets. But in this work, we are using neural implicit representations known as NERFs as our representation for encoding observations into a map. And you may be wondering, I'm going to explain what a NERF is, but before getting into that, I just want to justify this choice and explain why we went with neural implicit representation as a way of encoding our observation. One nice thing about NERFs is that they are very, very memory efficient. Let me explain how they work, and then I come back to this point of why NERFs are useful for this particular application. So at a very high level, what a NERF is a neural network with some parameters theta. And these parameters are essentially taking as an input the position and direction of the robot or the vehicle. And their output is essentially the RGB, the colors of the image, and the volumetric density that is associated with that position and direction. And the way that these models work is essentially we render images from the network output and compare that with some ground truth images, construct a loss function, which is our image rendering loss function, and optimize the parameters of the neural network such that the difference between the rendered images and the ground truth images is essentially minimized. And if you want to essentially use more sensory information, we can add a depth information to this matching and error minimization. So the cool thing about NERFs is that everything in the image rendering is really summarized and abstracted in the parameters of the neural network itself. And as a result of that, I do not need to essentially encode point clouds or feature grids that are very memory inefficient. And the nice thing about NERFs is that they can encode complex geometry, semantic information, appearance, all the things that really matter. And that is why they've been super, super useful in understanding scenes such as this one, and they can be combined with semantic information to really search for objects, let's say, as you can see in this video. But the more important aspect for us has been that NERFs are much more compact than explicit representations like 3D GS, 3D Gaussian splats, or point clouds or voxel grids. Here is a table of prior work that are essentially comparing the memory requirements of NERFs with these other explicit representations. And you can see that the memory requirements of NERFs is actually quite interesting compared to the other methods. It's orders of magnitude more memory efficient because their representation is actually very implicit. There is no explicit representation. So for these reasons, because of their success in the literature, and because they can be relatively fast to use with like 10 frames per second, we were like, okay, these models are really good for capturing geometry, and they're very compact. So maybe it makes sense to, let's say, use them in the context of mapping an unknown area where there are multiple robots and you want to have deploy things on the vehicle. So we were like, okay, let's just pick NERFs as our map representation. But how can we combine maps from different agents, assuming that every agent is maintaining a NERF as their local map? How should the combining of these networks look like? How can we have maps that each one of them is a neural network, and then we combine these implicit neural networks from different agents together to essentially reach a better understanding of a larger scene and a larger domain. For this, we have been looking into tools from distributed optimization, and I'm going to give you a very high-level description of these methods. So let's look at how centralized mapping versus decentralized mapping works at a high level. What I mean by centralized mapping, which is something that has been used a lot, is that we have multiple agents. Each one of them collect observations of an environment, collects, let's say, images, sends them to a central node or a central vehicle, and that vehicle puts all those images together, builds a map of the scene, and communicates that map back to every agent so that every agent knows about this larger scene and larger environment. This is very effective, but the problem that it has is that it essentially comes with a single point of failure. The fact that if the central vehicle is essentially not functional, the entire set of agents are essentially going to fail. The other thing is that it requires every agent to go back and forth between sending information to a central map, and if they get really far from the central vehicle, they need to go back and forth to communicate information with the central node. Instead, what we've been after is decentralized mapping in the sense that every agent collects their own information, builds its local map, and instead of sending images, which is quite costly in the real world, we just ask agents to share their maps with one another. And if agent shares its map with its neighbors, this is a lot more efficient than sending images, especially if you have communication constraints, because images are essentially high dimensional, whereas these maps, because they're just neural networks, essentially neural network parameters, these are much easier to share. So that's the setup that we are after. How can we build a resilient multi-agent mapping framework? As you can tell by the slide that I just showed you, I'm relying on communication among the agents. So I assume that there exists a communication graph where in my graph, every agent is a node, let's say node I, J, K, and then each edge in my communication graph is indicating whether those pair of agents are communicating with one another or not. So the edge I and J is denoting whether the communication between nodes I and J, and likewise for all the other agents. And what I'm interested in is that I want each of these agents to have their own neural implicit representation, communicate that with others, and collectively understand the scene. However, that is not a straightforward problem. Combining neural network implicit maps is not straightforward. Why is that the case? First of all, despite explicit maps, which are, as the name suggests, they're just explicit, such as point clouds, neural maps cannot be combined that easily. Because with explicit maps, such as point clouds, they can be easily combined after simply aligning their coordinate frames. You can have multiple information sources, let's say the green, yellow, and white. Each one of them is collected by a different agent. All you need to do is to coordinate their frames and then combine them together because they are explicit representations. But the challenge with neural implicit maps is that two neural networks can learn different ways to represent the same scene, so we cannot directly combine two neural networks with one another. If I have one map of the agent nerf learned by agent I, denoted by parameters theta I, and the nerf learned by agent J with its parameters denoted by theta J, how am I going to combine these? Because maybe for one network, one node or the parameters of one node were responsible for constructing parts of the scene. For the other network, that node or its activation functions they have a different responsibility. How can we autonomously combine these in a useful manner? So we were thinking about this question, and at a high level, our intuition was the following. Well, This may seem obvious, but it becomes clear in a moment why this is a useful thing. What we noticed was that in order for these maps to be useful, we want to have these neural implicit maps. We want to learn them in such a way that they reach consensus on how the environment should be represented by neural network parameters. What I mean by that is that we want to make sure that all these maps agree with one another in terms of what the scene should look like, the collective scene should look like. So our intuition and our insight was maybe we can use ideas from consensus optimization to have multi-agent neural implicit mapping. I can be clever with the way that I train these neural networks such that all these agents at the end of the day are going to agree with one another. And maybe that is going to abstract away the information that needs to be learned by all of them. Let me explain how this works, how we can cast multi-agent neural implicit mapping as a decentralized consensus optimization problem. Let's say I have two agents, I'm just simplifying things. Each of these agents gets their local images. So they collect their local images, they have their local image database, and they use their local images to train their network. They don't have to fully train it, maybe just run some number of gradient descent updates on their local network using loss minimization. So they just minimize their own objective function, L1 or L2. And just for your information, this notation, I'm using RI to denote the local images that are available to that agent. So every agent runs a number of gradient descents on its neural network parameters. Then they communicate their updated neural network parameters theta1 and theta2 with one another. So effectively what happens is that after each iteration round, each agent gets to have like a copy of like what the other agent thinks that the parameters should be. And then after that, we enforce a consensus. We are like, by the way, you two should agree on what this map should look like. And we repeat this process. So agents collect their information, they do subgradient descent updates, then they communicate what they think the map should look like, and we enforce consensus, and we repeat this process. So what it will look like, this collaborative mapping, is going to be the following. If all agents were doing a centralized mapping, they would have all tried to minimize the sum of these LIs, which are the local cost of mapping for every agent I. So we want to minimize the sum of these mapping errors. That's the team kind of objective. But we want to enforce this consensus that theta I and theta j, for any pair of agents that communicate with one another, their map parameters should be the same. That is what we call consensus. This is our consensus constraints. So and Zij is really our consensus target, which is a neural implicit map that a pair of agents should converge to. Excuse me, I'm still recovering from a lingering cough from a cold that I got like 4 weeks ago. So I hope that I can make it by the end of this talk. So this is kind of like the problem that I want to solve. This is my collaborative mapping problem. And the way to solve this in a distributed, decentralized fashion is the following. We can prove that every agent can construct its own augmented Lagrangian, where for those of you who are from optimization background, you probably know that this augmented Lagrangian for each agent is just going to be their local cost function plus some dual variables, lambda I and nu ij, penalizing for constraint violation, and a second term penalty that is deviating for constraint violation. So lambda ij and nu ij are my dual variables that penalize my constraint violations. And these are my augmented terms that are also enforcing consensus. So essentially, I'm adding these terms to make sure that I violate, that I penalize for a disagreement. And if agents violate the consensus, then they're going to be penalized for that. And this parameter rho here is just a constant. It's a hyperparameter that you could pick. It has to just be positive, and you can, this is a choice that one can make. So with this use of augmented Lagrangian, the way that the distributed optimization that we use for mapping looks like is the following. So two agents start, they store their local observations, then they update, they share their parameters, the parameters that they think the new neural network should look like with one another. And then they run this local minimization to update theta i's. And then after that, they do a dual gradient ascent to update the dual variables. And here, to just simplify things, I'm using pi to denote the sum of the dual variables lambda ij and nu ji. So I'm just compacting away the dual variables for a pair of agents in one variable pi. And this process is repeated until agents reach a good understanding of the scene. Actually, I saw that there was a question. I saw a hand being raised. Maybe it's a good time for me to pause to answer the question.
Hi, Negar. This is Vishwa. I had a quick question on your previous slide.
Sure.
So the second weightage parameter, the augmented terms, what effect are they achieving that the dual variables are not?
Great question, Vishwa. Thank you for asking that question. So essentially, you could remove this term. You can just keep the usual Lagrangian and run the essentially primal dual update. But the literature has shown that adding this second order penalty term helps you reach convergence with much fewer iteration. So it minimizes the iteration rounds for us.
So if you were to make the dual variables bigger, would that achieve the same effect? Or is it just...
No, actually, it wouldn't, because this is essentially shows up in the
It's a two norm.
Yeah, the second norm shows up in the update of theta as well, how you update your theta, right? Let's say you run a gradient descent with respect to theta on this term. That is, all of that cannot be captured by just increasing the dual variable. So in theory, both of them could work, but people have shown that with augmented Lagrangian, the number of iterations is less, but the compute that you need to do at each iteration increases.
Got it. Thank you.
Of course. So there was another question, I guess.
Yeah. Hi, thanks. And I was just wondering about with the constraint violations, are you guaranteed to find a solution that doesn't have any constraint violations?
That's a great
Or is that
question.
possible?
Yes, actually, people if everything is convex, this algorithm is guaranteed to reach convergence in the sense that you are not going to violate the constraint. That being said, the setup that we're working with is that we're using it when training neural networks. And you already probably know that neural networks by no means are very convex, at least the ones that we used. And it's hard with neural networks to give it provable convergence guarantees. But what we found was that, interestingly, it almost always worked. And it was more resilient than what we had thought. And the only setups when it didn't work was when the communication rate was really, really low. And I'm going to talk about that. And then we essentially figured out a way to even make that work with like 1% communication rate.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I'm excited to hear more.
Yeah, thank you. I think there was one more question.
So I'm just curious. So at the cost of convergence, you're probably losing some compression quality for each individual network. What each individual network is learning, it comes at a cost, right?
You're saying that because I'm using NERF, I'm losing expressivity? Is that what you're saying?
No, because you're trying to align them together. So they were just focused on one objective. Now you're diluting it into essentially two, right?
No,
Both
actually,
learn and converge.
I'll talk about this in more detail, but I'm not forcing one to just learn the objective of the other, but I'm trying and hoping that by enforcing this consensus, both of them optimize the sum of the local cost of every agent. It's not like I just want them to optimize the cost of just one agent. So my objective, if everything was convex, this optimization problem would have been the same as this one, which is minimizing the sum of the training loss of all the agents. And I'm going to show actually in a couple of slides how this works under different communication rounds or if different communication constraints. And in fact, our contribution throughout this line of work was to make sure that we are not losing the expressivity when we are aligning these maps with one another. But I'll talk about those in more detail in the next couple of slides. Thanks for the question. Okay. So if there are no more questions, let me just move on to essentially show you how these algorithms work. I think I already covered this slide. Here is just one example of 3 agents that are mapping, let's say, an environment, a room. And on the top, you see what would have happened if we have centralized mapping. All images were sent to just one agent and that agent did the mapping. And on the bottom, you see decentralized mapping, where agents got to only communicate their local maps with one another. And the interesting thing here is that the blue agent, for instance, only covers and gets to observe this part of the scene. But because it communicates its map parameters with others and enforces a consensus, this is the map that is rendered from the blue agent's perspective. Although it has only seen this room, because it communicates with these neighbors and enforces consensus, it still has a good understanding of parts of the scene that it didn't get to see on its own. So each agent only sees part of the scene, but because of this distributed optimization scheme, they obtain the whole map by requiring this consensus and agreement among the agents. So that was very exciting for us. And we were like, okay, this is great. Then I can have multiple agents out there. Each one of them is mapping just part of the environment. They talk with one another, and then they understand the whole scene. So we were like, let's just use this in the real world, see how that works. How does this multi-agent neural implicit mapping perform under real-world communication constraints? What happens if I use the same thing that I showed that it works in simulation in the real world? And we know that in the real world, communication dropouts are just very common. There's no way we can always have successful communication. What does that look like? So we ran an experiment in the lab where we essentially, this is a room in our lab, and one robot was doing a centralized mapping on its own. It mapped the environment. It collected all the images and learned a map based off of that. And on the right, I show you a decentralized mapping where the robot 1 only gets to see the green area, and robot 2 gets to see only the blue area. But the communication is noisy. The communication is not always successful. And because of that, if I just run this distributed optimization algorithm that I showed in the previous slide, this is what the map looks like. There is almost no useful information in this map. So we were like, wait, what? Things seemed to work out pretty nicely in simulation, but in the real world, because we had bandwidth limits in our experiments, and we only shared neural implicit maps with a very low frequency, less than 1 hertz, the quality of map was really bad. And we were like, okay, how can we fix this? Why is this happening? What's the root cause of this? And how can we correct this? So what happened was that this communication and this mapping and constraint optimization that I showed, this slide that I showed in the previous slide, this assumes synchronous communication. This assumes that at every iteration, the 2 agents always get to communicate their most recent information with one another. And the moment that this assumption is violated, whether it's because of bandwidth limit, whether it is because of obstacles between the agents or agents simply being out of range of each other. And because of that, our communication rate is less than 100%. Then essentially the whole thing becomes very fragile under these communication constraints. And we can't really get the nice results that we got in simulation in the real world. So we started to think, how can we get around this? Why is that happening? And how can we fix that? Our solution is something that we call ramen. You will notice that we really like food, and that's a common theme among what we call our algorithms. But I want to tell you what our insights were, which enabled us to do ramen. The key thing in ramen was that we essentially decided maybe instead of enforcing consensus, which may be too strong, maybe I can have only a weighted consensus, meaning that I just want to enforce alignment and agreement between the networks, dependent on how much they contribute to that task. What does that mean? Let's say I have two neural networks, theta I and theta j, and each one of them is used for mapping a scene, the same scene. And because these agents have had their own local observations, maybe their maps have different qualities at different regions of this scene. For example, the green area is what agent I could map with more accuracy, whereas the blue area is the area where agent J got to map with a high accuracy. But our task is that we want to understand and map the entire scene. So what happens when we enforce consensus? When we enforce consensus, we require these two maps to agree with one another. And what that means is that I'm requiring this green region, which is of higher quality, to agree with this region, which is of low quality, and essentially hurt the performance gains that I've got from agent I in parts of the scene, and the same thing for blue region. And ideally, what I want to have is that I want this region to agree with the blue region more, and this region to agree with the green region more. So I really want to be strategic on how to weight these agreements so that the weight of the blue region in enforcing consensus on the parts of the parameter space that contribute to the blue area is larger, and same thing for my green area. So what I really want to achieve is do weighted consensus to favor the parameters of my neural network that encode higher quality information. And I think this goes back to the question that someone asked, I think, which is we don't really want to sacrifice the performance by requiring these networks to agree with one another. So how can we autonomously figure out how to weight our consensus so that we don't lose information, we leverage that instead? So you may be wondering, okay, we can do weighted consensus, but how can we construct weights? Because, or notion of confidence on the parameters of a neural network. So we used a very, very simple trick, which turned out to be really effective. And that is the fact that we used some notion of a frequency to assign weights to the parameters of the neural network. Let's assume that we have a feature grid. And a feature grid is really a grid, you can have it at different resolutions, and it's a grid at any point in the space. You can essentially find out what its neighboring points are, what their features are, and interpolate between them. And you can use a feature grid in combination with a NERF to use the explicit representation of a feature grid. But to simplify things, let's say we have a feature grid, and I consider a point in 3D space. What I need to do is I essentially just find out its neighboring nodes. And I essentially, let's say, train a decoder, a NERF decoder for that point to find out what the RGB colors and the volumetric density of that point is. At a very high level, our intuition was that the confidence or uncertainty that we have over an area decreases monotonically with the frequency of observations. At a high level, the more an area, a 3D space, a point in 3D, the more it gets observed, the more we sense information about that point, the more certain we are about that point. And typically, the updates to a vertex primarily occur when the robot visits that spatial location. So for us, we started to play with this idea of maybe the notion of confidence or weight that I should have on every neural network parameter could be correlated with the number of gradient descent updates that parameter gets. Just simply count in my gradient updates in my neural network training, how many gradient updates each parameter of my neural network got, and use that as a notion of how much, as a proxy for how valuable that weight parameter is for contributing to the loss minimization. And obviously, we're going to normalize this to just make sure that our weights are bounded. So is this a good metric? Is this a good notion of confidence before we integrate this into our optimization pipeline? On the left, I'm showing you a scene that essentially has been mapped, and I'm visualizing these weight parameters that I showed that are counting the number of gradient descent updates of the parameters. And these purple areas are the ones that got more frequent gradient updates. And these ones are the ones that got less frequent updates. So we associate these areas with high certainty and these areas with higher uncertainty. And what we found was that these are actually highly correlated with the quality of the map. You can see that in low uncertainty areas, we have a high quality map, whereas in high uncertainty areas, we have a low quality map. So this notion of gradient descent updates, the number of them, might be a good proxy for us to know which parameters really matter for what parts of the scene. So we kind of picked that, and we were like, okay, we use this simple trick to create an uncertainty weighted CADMM or consensus ADMM, or the CADMM is really the name of the decentralized optimization algorithm. So instead of requiring a consensus in the form of both of the parameters should be the same, I'm just going to enforce a weighted consensus. I'm like, okay, I'm just going to weight the agreement between the agents based on how much they contribute to the quality of the map that they are building. And then I essentially have a weighted primal and dual update. Every agent is still doing things on its own, but my consensus is weaker in the sense that I'm just weighting everything. I want to influence the parameters in the favor of the high information parameters and informations that really matter for that scene. So with this simple adjustment, a weighted consensus, the same experiment that we ran in the lab that we failed is essentially working out much nicer. Again, robot 1 is only mapping the green area, and robot 2 is only mapping the blue area. And they get to communicate with one another once in a while. But you can see that the quality of the map that they start to build is much better than what we had before, which was purely noise. And the reason behind that is exactly because I'm doing a weighted consensus, meaning that when enforcing consensus between these two networks, I'm kind of implicitly telling my model that the parameters that contribute to the reconstruction of the left part should be more weighted towards the parameters of robot 1 and vice versa for robot 2. So this was something that we found out, and again, to just remind you of like what the performance looked like, this is my ground truth, this is my baseline with just distributed optimization without any weighted consensus. Things are going to fail, but with a proper weighting in our consensus constraint, when green robot is only exploring this region and the red robot is only exploring this region, we can still get to see a good map of the environment by both of the agents. We played with the performance of Raman under varying communication rates. Where like, if I just go from 100% communication rate all the way to 20% communication rate, how does the performance look like? So you can see with 100% communication rate, distributed optimization algorithm, CADMM that I showed at the beginning, it works quite nicely. But as I decrease my communication rate, the quality of the maps obviously decreases, but we see that the Raman gets to better catch up. For example, if you look at the chair areas, Raman is doing much better than consensus ADMM, which is distributed optimization. Or with 20%, I think this becomes even more evident that the consensus ADMM approach is essentially very blurry, but we get to at least reconstruct some finer details with Raman. We can back this up with some quantitative metrics. We can show that in terms of the artifacts, the percentage of holes or the number of holes that we get in the scene, and the completion ratio that we get, Raman is always doing better than just distributed optimization, distributed stochastic gradient descent, and its variance. So we were very encouraged by it. But we really wanted to go further. And if I go back to the previous slide, you can see that when the communication drops to, let's say, 20% of the times, the quality really decreases. And we were wondering, what if we really want to push the communication rate down to, let's say, 1% of the times, 5% of the times? What happens if you really want to communicate, if you're really interested in really low communication rates, like 1%? And the motivation for us, why we might be interested in doing that, was we wanted to essentially imagine scenarios where we can send agents to explore some really distinct locations and just occasionally move into the communication range with one another to share information, and then go back, explore on their own, and then come back, share a little bit of information, and then continue with their exploration. So what we found out was that Raman, although it was very successful, it starts to diverge when the communication rate is extremely low. For example, this is my ground truth mesh and the agent trajectories, green, blue, and red. I have 3 agents in this case. And what we found was that this is what Raman does at 20%. You could argue this is still good enough. But if I take my communication rate down to 1%, you can see that, again, the quality of what I reconstruct is almost like noise. There is no useful information here. So we were looking into this, and we were wondering why. What is contributing to that? Why is it that Raman fails at this extreme low communication rates? And in particular, what we did was we took a look at the dual variable of how that dual variable operates as we are iterating over these variables. So we really looked at how the dual variable behaves at different iterations for Raman and CADMM, which is our distributed optimization, the vanilla distributed optimization algorithm, at 1% communication rate. You can see that my dual variable PI with CADMM, which is just vanilla distributed optimization, it oscillates a lot. And we have managed to decrease the oscillations with Raman, which is the blue curve. But still, even with Raman, the dual variables are essentially oscillating a lot. So we were like, what is causing this? Why is it our dual variable is essentially resulting in divergence? And what we found out was that because in the original formulation that we had, there is only one single dual variable that aggregates all prior dual variables that results in divergence. So if you look at the dual update for Raman for each agent I, the dual update looks something like this. PI at iteration t plus 1 is PI at iteration t plus something that depends on the weights and the deviations between, or the difference between theta I and theta j. But at a high level, what is happening here is that this dual variable, PI, is accumulating consensus violations from all past neighbors. And as a result of that, agents that are no longer in communication with one another, they still continue to influence the optimization process simply because their past constraint violation, the difference between these, is essentially accumulated in my PI. So when all agents are currently essentially trying to enforce a consensus, each agent is still getting penalized by information that is outdated at the moment from long disconnected neighbors. Let me explain this intuition through a figure. If communication was frequent, if I look at how the dual variable behaves for my system, at iteration 0, I have an initial guess of my dual variable. Then in the next iteration, I look at the deviation between theta I and theta k, and I look at the deviation difference between theta I and theta j, and all of them contribute to my PI. The sum of them contributes to my PI at iteration 1. Same thing at the next iteration. I look at the deviations, sum them up, and that will be my next PI. And these are essentially accumulating things that happened in the past. Same thing for agent 4, and then this ends up being my PI over time. So this is how my dual variable is oscillating if I had frequent communication rounds. But when communication is dropped for a long time, let's say I and J don't get to communicate at iteration 2 and 3, what happens is that I essentially still maintain the impact of theta I minus theta j for the first iteration. It is still going to be there, and that results in a dual variable which is diverging, or it is not behaving the way that I really wanted it to behave. So our solution to fix this was what we call UDAN, where we modified our dual variables to prevent divergence. And the idea that we had here was actually quite simple. We were like, okay, what if we define and assign a unique dual variable instead of just having one single dual variable that captures all sums up all consensus violations over the pairs of the agents? What if I just use a pair of a unique dual variable for each pair of communicating neighbors? So what that means is that while the dual update for my Raman algorithm looked like this, I just had one PI, and then it accumulated things from the past plus the difference from neighbors at the current time step. In my UDAN dual update, what I do is that I define a dual variable for each pair of agents that are currently communicating with one another, and only propagate the effect of communicating neighbors that are relevant to that pair. And that's going to also show up in the primal update of my algorithm. While in Raman, my primal update looked like this, I was minimizing my augmented Lagrangian. In UDAN, because I no longer have just one single PI, I'm essentially changing my primal update to account for the impact of all these pairwise PIs. So I penalize theta I and its deviations from its neighbors J by using the dual variable that is unique to that pair instead of aggregating and collapsing all of them in one single dual variable. And this very simple trick results in having performance which is much better than Raman in extreme communication rates. So this is an example where I still have my ground truth images and ground truth map. I have 3 agents essentially collecting information. If agents do not communicate with one another, only just use their local information, this is obviously the map that they get, which is not really that useful. If I used a distributed optimization algorithm or Raman, again, it's not something that you can tell is useful. But with just simple trick using UDAN, which is our method, we essentially managed to build a really, really good construction quality, given the fact that the communication rate is only 1%. Only 1% of the times the communication is successful among the agents. And we are comparing with an existing algorithm called MACIM, which you can see is essentially more blurry compared to what we do. And to me, this was very interesting to show that with only 1% communication rate, you can go from this region and this performance to this region, which I find it to be really impressive. And we found that we can actually scale things up with the number of agents. We can have, let's say, the same as scene with 4 agents, and we can see that what we do is, in terms of the reconstruction quality, what we do is more accurate. We can repeat this with 6 agents, and as you might expect, with more agents, because we have more coverage of the scene, the performance gets slightly better. Now we have some agents that are mapping this area or this area. And then you can see that here we actually recover a much better quality of the map by understanding the couch thanks to this yellow agent essentially trying to map this area, whereas with the state-of-the-art, this area is still quite blurry. And we can continue with that. We can add 2 more agents, add 8 agents, and then we can see that now we have agents that are essentially exploring this area and this area. And as a result of that, the kitchen area is now looking more accurate, and we have a much better understanding of the kitchen area, although the agents are communicating only 1% of the times. But our findings were backed up by the experiments that we ran in the lab. We ran in the same room that you saw. We had obstacles, and we were running these robots around when we really, really wanted them to communicate very in kind of only 5% of the times in a very low communication rate. And we found out again that Udon is beating all the other methods across all the metrics, such as number of artifacts, number of holes, or completion ratio. So this has been an interesting line of work for us, showing that distributed optimization combined with these modern computer vision techniques is actually quite powerful in doing things that we couldn't do before. But we've been looking at the dual of this problem too. I just want to quickly explain that in the interest of time, which is an algorithm that we call TACO. And the idea of TACO is actually quite the dual of this problem. So far, I've been using consensus optimization to enforce agreement between the maps of different agents. But we started to think that maybe I can actually use that instead of enforcing consensus between different agents at each time, which is at time 1, I want the maps to agree with one another. At time 2, I want the maps to agree with one another, and so forth. Maybe I can use this consensus ideas instead to enforce consensus between one map over time to enable continual learning of the scenes. What do I mean by that? I looked at this alternative problem, which is, let's say I have just one robot. It doesn't have to be multiple robots, but these robots are that robot over time is collecting new informations, and it wants to continually learn based off of this new information that it gets in a way that it doesn't forget about things that are relevant from the past, but it also adapts to new changes in the scene and learns from the new information in the scene. And our idea was maybe we can view that as a consensus problem. Maybe I want to enforce a weighted consensus between the agents' maps over time. So we were like, okay, now we can have a temporal consensus view of continual learning, and I can essentially have just one agent. I have its neural network weights. I have the importance of each one of these neural network weights when it comes to reconstruction quality. Then I move on to T+1, my next time. But because I want my network to not forget about things that it has learned in the past, I enforce a consensus constraint, meaning that I really want to essentially abstract away information that is relevant from the previous time step, and then enforce this consensus through primal dual update across time steps. And what we found that was really interesting. So here is another example of experiments that we ran in the lab. On the left, you see this is what our algorithm Taco does. The scene changes. For example, the yellow chair moves from point A to point B. But because our algorithm has this consensus, it manages to learn that the scene has changed to the new point while not forgetting about the features that are relevant in the map. Whereas with the state-of-the-art algorithms, which are oftentimes of two sorts, either they are replay-based, meaning that they collect all the past data that the robot has seen, we can see that the robot maintains 2 copies of that same chair. Or the other alternative in this state-of-the-art is to use regularization-based approaches where we regularize the network so that it doesn't forget about things that it has learned in the past. And as a result of that, regularization-based methods cannot really adapt to the changes in the scene. But we can see that with this temporal consensus interpretation of continual learning, we can adapt to the changes in the scene without forgetting the details and the structure that matters in the scene. Here's another example that, for example, the table has moved and this other table is moved, but we can see, actually, sorry, this was the tree and the back. And you can see that it is only our method that adapts to the changes in the scene, whereas the others either freeze what they've learned in the past or maintain 2 copies of the same thing.
Well, I'm sorry to say we only have a few minutes left.
Yes, so thank you for the heads up. I actually think I just want to end here at a quick note. We've been working across learning aspects of these problems. How can we get to coordinate agents with one another? We've been working across the planning and control pipeline of how can we make sure that agents can coexist with others. And we've also been thinking about how to enforce safety constraints for each one of these policies to guarantee that the robot is never going to violate the constraints. So with that, I should thank my students who actually did the work that I got to present here today. And thank you all for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
See, there's a question online.
Yes, thank you. This is really cool stuff. And I have a question. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but this sounds like my understanding is you're doing some through your consensus algorithm, some type of a self-partitioning. Let's put it that way, through your iterative updates. The extreme case of that would be block partitioning. So that would be hard. And of course, there's always going to be overlap. But there are probably extreme cases where there's no communication for long stretches of time. Like you're observing a subterranean field, things like that, right? Is there sort of a hybrid version of this that might work?
That's actually a great question. And one of the things that we have been thinking about is exactly that aspect, Salman, which is, can we have like a hybrid approach where I can have submaps of different regions? Let's say I'm like, I essentially want one agent to take care of the room and the other agent to take care of the hallway, and just enforce consensus for maybe parts of these maps that overlap with one another. Not the entire map. Maybe I don't require them to essentially agree on the entire map. And if you really want to map a super large area, I think that's what you should do, which is everyone is taking care of, like, have a partitioning of your the area that you're interested in, and maybe only enforce consensus on the parameters on the parts of these submaps that overlap with one another. I think you're right, and I think that is actually something really interesting. We haven't got to do that, but I think there's definitely room to do that, because then you can, let's say if I wanted to map my department, Echeverry Hall at Berkeley, I don't want all the agents to agree on everything, but maybe one agent is doing mapping the half of the first floor, the other is mapping the other half of the first floor, and maybe I just want to enforce consensus on the boundary between these halves, for example.
And I see Husni, do you have a short question?
It was related to this one, actually. I was going to ask how
Sure.
when the robots, you say one can only see the red region, one can only see the green region, but the images overlap, right? And so you're not constraining the sharing of the information to be not include any overlaps, right? And so I think it's related to the previous question, right? So,
sorry, I'm not sure if I
so when
understood
one
your
robot,
question.
when one robot in the experiments that we showed, you said one sees the red region, one sees, I forget the colors. Do you constrain the cameras so that they're only taking images of one region or not, so they don't see the other region
Yeah,
at all?
that's a
Or how
good,
do you guarantee that only
yeah, that's a
one?
good question. That's a very good question. Let me actually go back to hopefully that experiment. So in fact, we had some kind of boundary in the area where we were like, let's just, I think we created that boundary using some obstacles. Yeah, here it is. It's not playing. Let me see. Oh, here. So you remember this is the boundary that we put in. We were like, this robot should never go beyond this boundary region. But there is some overlap between the images that the robots collect because there was no way for us to constrain the camera to just be like, you shouldn't see anything past this line. So there is a little bit of an overlap, but the robot itself never crossed this boundary, although its camera, dependent on what its range range sensor is, could essentially see parts of the blue region if it got too close to this boundary region.
Right. Yeah, I guess I'll need to see. Well, another quick question, maybe when you talk about the temporal consensus, and you mentioned earlier that having previous neighbors was badly affecting your results. Later, then you said temporal consensus is actually useful. So is there a connection between these two? I would expect that the previous neighbors had some history that might be useful.
Yeah. So that's a very good question. And I want to clarify the temporal consensus is for the learning of just one agent itself. Imagine there is no multi-agent aspect on that project in the sense that there are multiple robots. It's just the same robot that is mapping an environment, that environment is changing, right? So it is, I'm saying that in order for the robot to adapt to the changes in the scene while not forgetting about things that it has learned in the past, maybe I can just enforce consensus between what the robot currently thinks the scene should look like and what it would look like in the past. So I'm not requiring consensus between multiple robots. That being said, if you enforce temporal consensus, let's say between what the robot has seen now and what it saw long time ago, it may still have that same impact of essentially using information that is really outdated, information you are enforcing consensus between your current time step and things that are really, really old in the sense that they are not even relevant to what you want to do now. So it has the same danger, but what we did in practice was that we were enforcing consensus only with the past or the information from the past 2 iterations, because we didn't want to, let's say, overfit to things that were not really relevant for the current time, but they have the same nature in that sense.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Really nice work.
I want to thank you so very much. We're really running over time now.
Thank you, everyone.
But thank you, really outstanding talk. I wanted to say that next speaker will be here in person and will be Dr. Alvaro Cardenas, a professor from Computer Science and Engineering Department at UC Santa Cruz with the subject of securing and defending against next generation embodied UAS. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.